College here, and Lorna is going to be talking about writing against silence. Thank you, Lorna.
Hello, Catherine, and thank you very much.
Do you want to upload your slides? Or
I do, and like that, it was all good to go. Where has it gone? For just 2 moments now, and it took come up. Oh, no, not that one. Cancel that one. Actually, would Carly be able to do it, or shall I do it? I'll try it again.
I've got them.
Oh, here we go. This is me.
Sorry,
just make it larger. Sorry, I was foostering around there for a moment. And this is the start of my slide presentation. Thank you. So I'll begin. So, writing against silence. Literature has the capacity to articulate our place in the world, how we see ourselves and how we interact with our fellow human beings. With her empathetic investigations, Edna O'Brien enhanced a further understanding into the lives of Irish Catholic women. As a mature student here in Mary Immaculate College, I was introduced to her work through an academic lens, work told throughout her career of more than 60 years, in a literature that provides a rich and worthy cultural piece of history, ranging in a variety of genres from short stories to plays, novels and poetry. With such a vast canon to choose from, my presentation will reference her short story format only. Often controversial, her stories have provided a useful angle to examine the lives of women and mothers whose living conditions were strongly conditioned by Catholic beliefs. In her texts, she wrote back against their voicelessness of the time. The special position afforded to the Catholic and Apostolic Roman Church as the guardian of the faith in De Valera's new constitution of 1937 reaffirmed many Catholic beliefs and values. The influence that this special position afforded to the Church was keenly felt by women because, twinned with politicians and male authorities, it rendered them voiceless. Compounding this status was the basic Catholic social teaching that gave priority to the sacredness of the maternal role. This, in turn, gave a moral monopoly to principles of purity, with the cult of the Virgin Mary held up as an ideal. In a nation-state such as Ireland, which was predominantly a Catholic country at the time, the purity of the citizens was to be upheld by the women, as per the dogma inculcated in churches, homes and schools. If the family unit is central to social control and social order, in the aftermath of Irish independence and the Civil War, modest, chaste Catholic women were held up as an ideal standard to attain. This ideal was especially symbolic against the English Protestant colonisers, whose Victorian British middle-class values were adopted and surpassed here in Ireland, a country with a Catholic moral hegemony. A strict moral censorship was imposed by the Church and State until the late 1960s, with Magdalene homes or emigration available for women who transgressed. Applying these principles of Victorian values had the dual benefit of fostering a belief that the home was the safest domestic place for women and also for the survival of the family unit. Such principles equally helped to regulate the inheritance of land in an agrarian society. The cult of the Virgin Mary has the greatest influence in countries where women are primarily wives and mothers, and Ireland was authenticated via the Catholic identity of its women. Irish women were dependent on the Church for status and authority, and this perpetuated the cycle until it became innate. The Magdalene myth made their sins of the flesh all the more significant, and their fall becomes a public shame because of the Virgin myth. Edna O'Brien has been shaped by her Catholic upbringing, and this openness to religion is reflected in her writing. She is often cited as saying that the ordinary trials of a nun weren't enough for her. She wanted to be a saint. Regarding silence. The silencing of men and women of her parents' generation perceived in her text stems from religious teachings and guilt that controlled their sexuality. Having rejected the modest virgin stereotype championed by the Catholic Church, she narrates instead the emotional isolation of a submerged people. In characters responding to their environment, she reveals the conflict between the individual's capacity for developing an imaginative response and the internalized restrictions on personal growth inherent in us all. Catholic sexual attitudes that women had been used to were publicly brought out from the private sphere by the author through female characters suffering such exploitation. Described in all their mediocrity and absurdity, neither satiric nor heroic, Stories such as A Scandalous Woman, which I'll expand on shortly, is an ideal text to critique modern mass culture. Edna O'Brien showcases traits in her protagonists who are depicting a particular moment in time to record injustices and voice their social protest through imagery and symbolism. Without resorting to strong verbal attacks on institutions such as churches or school, but by underlying societies experiencing turmoil from new beginnings to depict the struggle of the submerged peoples in their narratives. In an Ireland that had a stagnant economy, a repressive religious ethos, and an inward-looking society, loneliness was a key concern for O'Brien, and this loneliness experienced within a family or marriage was depicted by the author to fill the lacuna to understanding the sexual nature and desires of women. The beginning of this change to publicly acknowledge female desire coincides with the swinging 60s of London, where Edna O'Brien had relocated following her marriage. The ripple effect of the 60s London saw the founding of the Irish women's movement in 1970. Also at this juncture, publishing houses were more open to women writers and their issues, and O'Brien documented the slow progress women were making for equality in all fields. She gave voice to female sexuality, desires, and the mother and daughter relationship. Her writing contributed to a growing momentum of thought dealing with the frankness of repressed female sexuality. The groundwork of 60s feminism was mirrored by O'Brien as she noted the rapid pace of change Ireland was undergoing for women who had previously been trapped in rigid stereotypes of fixed identities. Irish women were not afforded much of a public voice in Ireland prior to joining the EU, and O'Brien cleverly uses two motifs to highlight the silence. The first motif of silence is a dream sequence, and that involves severing the tongue. In this, a mother violates her daughter's organ of speech to keep her silent but safe. And secondly, is the use of letter writing. As a narratological device from mother to daughter, it affords them both some space for intergenerational conflicts to be addressed. By entwining these two motifs, O'Brien underscores the author's personal depth of feeling regarding female muteness and oppression in Ireland at the time. The author's mother, Mrs. Lena O'Brien, continued to live in Tuamgraney, where her daughter's novels were censored and frowned upon by the state and church. The symbolism of cutting her daughter's tongue was to safeguard both ladies, and the copious letters, penned instead, privately explained all that was unsaid by a silent and passive mother who unveiled difficult truths in her correspondence. Examples of letter writing are littered throughout her canon, and from the short stories alone, we see it in texts such as Chords, A Scandalous Woman, A Rose in the Heart, My Two Mothers. Here are testimonies recorded through letters which offer a critical framework to the Irish female to reveal the private reflections of the home, family, and religion in Ireland. These letters offer a means of remaining attached while yielding towards a reconciliation between generations now that physical space and time lies between them. Living in London allowed Edna O'Brien and many other immigrants the ability to escape, to be free, to disavow their mothers and the religious beliefs indoctrinated at home. The second motif, the trope of silence, is best demonstrated in her character Eli from A Scandalous Woman. This story is set in a locality where events or anything new was immediately noticed and commented upon, anything that distracted from the drudgery of female agrarian life, and in this instance it is a dress dance in aid of the new mosaic altar. This is where a character named Eli marked her debut at the religious fundraising event. Eli, who helped out on the farm and used not to be let out much, is permitted a reprieve from home to attend, and at the dance she was not off the floor once. When the young friends chat in the supper room, Eli confided to me that something out of this world had taken place. Almost immediately after, she was brought home by her sister Nuala. From the opening lines, the scene establishes the young naive girl whose innocence and youth are swiftly taken advantage of by a character named Jack, a Protestant no less. Eli's feminine desires were problematized by historical and religious causes in a veil of silence that was handed down between the generations. When her dalliance with Jack is discovered, Eli is locked up by her parents in their oat room until a hasty marriage can be arranged. During this waiting period, Eli was silence itself. Underscoring this silence speaks volumes for the futility of the female voice in shaping her own future, her own destiny, wants, or sufferings. Even to her mother she refused to speak. With her expulsion from the parish, this daughter, Eli, will be a huge loss to the mother, both emotionally and in terms of physical labour too. Likened to the modern Magdalene, she sacrifices herself for her parents' reputation, and the mother and daughter's lonely condition will only be alleviated with letter writing, every second week at that. The mother's silence denotes the passive nature of her position within the family, and even when Eli's much hoped for son Jack is born, the family were notified by wire and did not visit. These letters and wires become the only mode of communication between the women. The second story I'm going to refer to is called My Two Mothers, and this story opens and closes with a dream about a mother who's holding a razor in her hand to cut out the protagonist's tongue. The psychological impact of writing felt by her mother is only appreciated in retrospect by a mature O'Brien, who later recognised her mother's vulnerability. Therefore, by violating the organ of speech and keeping her daughter mute in the dream sequence, could the strong bond remain intact and her mother remain safe. The story bookends with the dream, and in the dream, I'm going to quote from the text here, there's a kidney-shaped enamel spittoon, milk white and a gleaming metal razor such as an old-fashioned barber used. My mother's hand is on the razor, and then her face comes into view, swimming as it were towards me, pale, pear-shaped, about to mete out its punishment, to cut the tongue out of me. Then with the glidingness the dream is over, and I waken shaking, having escaped death not for the first time. In dream, my mother and I are enemies, where in life we are so attached we could almost be called lovers. I began to write, jottings that had to be covert because she would see them in sort of wanderlust. She insisted that literature was a precursor to sin and damnation. I wrote, and she silently seethed. She would tell me what others, the neighbours, thought of what I wrote, tears in her voice at my criminality. In the story of My Two Mothers, the protagonist marries, divorces, and subsequently moves to England. And again I quote, "Then came years and years of correspondence from her. She who professed disgust at the written word wrote daily, bulletins that ranged from the pleading to the poetic, the philosophic and the commonplace. I never fully read them, being afraid of some greater accusation. For 20-odd years I had postponed opening the bundles of letters that lay in my house, in a leather trunk, enjoinders that I had not read and not the heart to destroy. Her letters were deeper, sadder than I remembered, but what struck me most was their hunger and their thirst. Here was a woman desperately trying to explain herself and to be understood. There were hundreds of them, or maybe 1,000. The mother's hunger and thirst mentioned here denotes her drive and voracious appetite to be understood. Both women mediate their emotions through writing, the mum via letters and the daughter as an author. And in the last line here, late in the evening, she began her last letter. My hand is shaking now as well as myself with what I have to tell you. It remains unfinished, which is why I wait for the dream that leads us beyond the ghastly white spittoon and the metal razor, to fields and meadows up onto the mountain, that bluish realm, half earth, half sky, towards her dark man, to begin our journey all over again, to live our lives as they should have been lived, happy, trusting, and free of shame. Again this shame, the shame that we saw just now with Eli and all the other sacrificial women O'Brien was representing, that she linked into a reproduction of her own family as a doubling for the nation. By highlighting the plight of these isolated mothers, O'Brien's imbrication of femininity with the national allegory has transformed them from shamed, guilty women into universal protagonists of Irish history who can be reconciled with their daughters. Her self-expression was a freeing art form that awoke in women what they may have been thinking privately, but she states it publicly to empower them. No longer as influenced by church teachings, it paved the way for new freedoms that Ireland, unlike London, had yet to negotiate. In conclusion, Her autobiographical stories have challenged, entertained, and explored the psychological strains of the private individual that spoke to the Irish female diaspora. O'Brien's acute investigations into the complexities of the life of an Irish Catholic woman saw her writing protest against the chastity of Irish womanhood in characters such as Eli and again the unnamed daughter of my two mothers. Her restrained style allows the readers to see in the spaces that her writing created their own position. And in examining the short stories regarding mothers, I came to know my own mother, my siblings, and myself. Edna O'Brien's texts enable us to look within ourselves and celebrate the uniqueness of an individual life lived that sustains us and bridges gaps between religion and individuals. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna, for a wonderful paper as well, and much to think about. I hope my mic is on this time. I'm going to keep going on.